I think I've saved the best for last, or at least the part that I think really ties into a lot of international relations that I teach and that I study, and that really places this relationship between oil and conflict, which can often be focused on the individuals and groups within a particular area, and really broadens the perspective back and looks at how corporations, other governments, and international organizations can play crucial roles in providing stability and transparency using a couple of creative efforts. One is largely seen as more successful than the other, and the two that we're focusing on, EITI, is seen as being something that has more momentum than the Kimberley Process. We're going to get to each one in turn. So how can international actors get involved in natural resource related conflicts and in natural resource dependent countries? There are a lot of unsavory ways. I'll start with that before I get to the more savory ways that they can get involved. The photo here is definitely before your time, but it is Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in an effort during the Reagan administration to try to establish more closely related ties during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. International companies, the U.S. had a scandal, the Arms for Hostages scandal, when the U.S. was trying to sold arms to Nicaragua in order to get money to be able to help pay Iran for the hostages back in the early days of the Reagan administration. But international corporations and governments, by and large, have had a mixed history in trying to encourage good behavior, democracy, and transparency in a lot of these areas. I mentioned the French oil company that got involved in Congo-Brazzaville. The other photo is from a press report in which you had these executives of the French oil company, now defunct ELF, in funding the rebel groups in order to try to take control of the government. Often there's side payments, and I mentioned these in which a lot of this money flows across borders, and that can buy you a lot of influence, control, as well as some pretty random stuff. I don't think we've talked about Equatorial Guinea in this case. In this country, this is a country that's seen, as you can see from the graph on the right, quite dramatic growth in gross domestic product. Now in 2019, the gross national income, current U.S. dollars, is over 6,000 U.S. dollars, which is still like a tenth of what it would be here in Australia, right? But you see this incredibly small country off the coast of West Africa. Most of the production in the capital is actually off the on one of the islands there. The leadership there, I think the leader now has, if not the distinction for being the longest serving leader in the world, one of the longest serving leaders. His children, just like Saddam's and others, often can lead quite creative lives. It connects to my life and my experience in Los Angeles because of this absolutely huge mansion that the son of the Equatorial Guinean president, he had to, Teodoro Ngoma Obiang's, had to basically flee the country because a couple of people who worked on his at his house accused him of basically forced labor. The amount of taxes that was owed, he ended up having to flee the country, never really stood trial. He did own Michael Jackson. I think he still owns Michael Jackson's glove from the 1980s, as well as his Thriller jacket. Had a really impressive car collection. His house was right there off the PCH. But you have people who have money that park a lot of it over in other parts of the world, including in Malibu. So you have a country that you have a incredibly low standard of living, but then you have people whose even children can buy and have assets that the rest of the people's the citizens within the country couldn't even dream of. You see this huge inequality because of these kind of side payments and the lack of transparency in where the money actually goes. With the EITI videos, you saw how the Nigerian government committed to try to be more transparent with oil sector agreements. But then in a previous lecture, I showed you the pile of cash that the head of the Secret Service was able to stash in some random apartment, and there's been allegations of corruption in Nigeria as well. So you have a whole bunch of projects going on in a whole bunch of different places, a lot of money at stake, a lack of transparency or incentives to either corrupt or look the other way can be quite dramatic. This connects to one of my research papers that when I get done recording videos like this, I can actually get back to over the summer, looking at foreign direct investment in the mineral sector in sub-Saharan Africa. So I gathered data from the Financial Times database on foreign direct investment, looking at projects from 2003 to 2017. I plotted them here on this map. You can see a lot of them clustered along the coast. You can also in Egypt see the outline of the Nile River. But for me, I was interested in looking at foreign direct investment because in some of my previous research, you see that foreign direct investment often decreases around conflict. And the conventional wisdom is that foreign investors are skittish and that they draw their money out, as I mentioned before, right? That how their relationship can be endogenous. When there's a risk of conflict, people who can take their business elsewhere do so. All that's left are those national resource extraction corporations. And so I was really interested in looking at how these corporations can still exist in areas in which there is conflict and what kind of agreements they have to make and whether conflict could be an opportunity for profit. And so if there is increased insecurity, that can increase the risk premium, how much these corporations can ask in order to do business. I opened with a case in the paper of Anvil Mining, an Australian mining corporation. There was a Four Corners episode about it 15 years ago. They were working in an area in eastern Congo. A new rebel group took over this one village near where they were working. The next day, the government used some of Anvil Mining's trucks and equipment to go in and attack the rebel group, killed about 100 people, and reduced the risk there. The mining corporation said that they had no choice. They didn't have any involvement in providing those trucks and resources. However, non-coincidentally or coincidentally, within about a year, they had a huge expansion of one of their mines within 50 kilometers of that village, in which they plowed in over 500 million more Australian dollars into the investment. And so that case kind of sparked my interest to see whether getting on one side or another's good side during this conflict can increase access that would have long-term benefits, right? These mining operations can often cost billions of dollars, right? To be able to extract, it takes a lot of infrastructure, building roads, bringing in the heavy machinery, exporting all the goods, and so that can provide incentives to support one side or the other that you think are going to do well. Another side example during the DRC's instability in the last 15 or 20 years, after Laurent Kabila forces took over and kicked out Mobutu Sese Seko in 1998 in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the next couple of years, Rwanda, which had backed Laurent Kabila and where he started his march across the country before taking over, they started to export gold, and Uganda exported hundreds of millions of dollars of gold after Kabila took power in the DRC. However, Rwanda and Uganda don't really have any gold deposits worth speaking of, and so you see how the access to these resources and the way to funnel them out can vary dramatically whether you have a friend in the source country. So yeah, this kind of foreign direct investment is increasing. The amount investment, as we all still depend on resources, have increased. So you see FDI to Africa has at least kept pace. in percentage terms compared to the rest of the world, because it is a huge continent with 1 billion people on it that's growing quite dramatically, has been relatively underexplored. And this foreign direct investment for mining, but also increasingly for services, is more than the foreign assistance that a lot of these countries receive. And especially in an age of COVID and donor fatigue, foreign direct investment can be a more dependable source of revenue that can come with less strings attached than foreign aid often can come with. So those are the kind of less savory ways of getting international attention and involvement. Some more savory ones by the UN Security Council. They do general reports like this expert report in the DRC from 2016. The World Bank, Publish What You Fund, Aid Transparency. There's been a lot of push towards increasing transparency and resources, because the international community as well as academics understand the importance of a lack of transparency and corruption in increasing the risk for side payments, private goods, and the risk of conflict. EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, has started publishing guidelines, as they just did a couple of days ago, to try to increase standards, and as you saw in the videos, for transparency. It has buy-in by a lot of these organizations, large mining corporations, because of the influence of activist shareholders, or just the share markets, in trying to, as well as us standing at the pump, trying to want to increase transparency. You see efforts towards living wages, Kimberley Process, conflict diamonds, those kind of things. The mining industry as a whole has tried to increase this transparency. You see the countries that have become members and compliant, the ones in green. These ones are suspended for lack of following the rules. CAR, DRC, Yemen, Sierra Leone. But you see the U.S. as a candidate country, Ukraine, Afghanistan. You see the number of countries actually swelling, and the ones in gray are the ones that are intending to implement. Australia is not one of those, which I think is interesting, given the amount of resources that are involved in our exports. So EITI, what is it? Where did it come from? What does it do? You saw a bit from the video. It was formed in 2003. It was a global standard to promote open and accountable management of natural resources. The GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, would be another one related to climate change and what companies are doing to try to be sustainable. This one is related to resources. 52 implementing countries, with 31 compliant according to the 2011 rules. You see those. Some are making satisfactory progress, some are making inadequate, but it's a learning process. It's slow and it's uneven, but you see some regional clustering of these kind of initiatives. Here's a list of those different countries that are involved, if you're interested. Why is this transparency important? I think we've already kind of touched on a lot of those reasons. The one thing that I think is useful is to try to think about another resource besides oil. We've been talking about oil for a while. Diamonds are a mineral that has industrial uses through drills, through refining, sanding, drilling. It's hard, right? So it's useful for cutting other things. For me, I think one of the interesting histories, and the literature this week talked about how different forms of diamonds can have different effects. This is one big honkin' diamond. It's the Cullinan diamond. It was the largest gem quality diamond in the world, over 3,000 carats. It was discovered over a century ago in South Africa. Its value itself, 3,000 carats, one rock that you could put in a suitcase, was $2 billion. It came from this one specific mine. It was broken up into a bunch of different stones and refined, but it shows how small and easily transported some resources are that have a high dollar value. Do you know how much $2 billion in oil would cost, and how big that would be, and how hard it would be to transport? As one rock, it was cut up into 8, I believe, different stones. The one in the middle is the largest and the most impressive, and it is now at 530 carats in the scepter with the cross. I went to London, but I never went and saw the crown jewels. Now I wish I had. But this scepter with the cross was what Queen Elizabeth II was holding during her coronation in 1953. And is another example of how goods and money often flow to the former colonial powers. But you see this mine, it's currently almost 750 meters deep, and it can go down to 1,000 meters, but it is a mine that dwarfs the village next to it, and that requires a lot of capacity and investment in machinery in order to export. The Humphreys article for this week talked about the difference between alluvial and kimberlite diamonds. Botswana is another example, like South Africa, that they have the kimberlite diamonds that require infrastructure and investment, similar to an oil field. This is where it is. It's also quite near the capital city in Johannesburg. Been meaning to go on a tour, maybe one of these days. Contrast that kind of kimberlite diamond mining organization with alluvial diamond mines in Sierra Leone. This Koidu mine in Sierra Leone requires basically no infrastructure. People can pan for gold. You can also pan for diamonds in the sand that washes down. This was credited with one of the as being one of those extractable natural resources that ended up making the conflict in Sierra Leone worse. I think Leo DiCaprio has an entire movie about it, but you can see the distance from where this alluvial diamond mine is to the capital. Contrast that with the Cullinan mine to this mine in Sierra Leone. Vastly easier to get to the neighboring border than it is to get to the capital city on the coast. Diamonds are easy to smuggle, hard to trace, and the efforts that the Kimberley Process have made is to try to reduce the export of diamonds that are associated with conflict. The Kimberley Process was started in the same year as the EITI was. It has a concrete definition of what a conflict diamond is. Rough diamonds used by rebel movements to finance wars against legitimate governments. It only applies to rough diamonds, not ones that have already been cut. They have a certification scheme that rules the government that governs the trade in diamonds. As of 2013, there were 54 participants representing 81 countries, with the EC European Community representing 1. So it has a larger number of countries involved, and they include almost all the major rough diamond producing and exporting countries. It is seen as being a questionable global witness, one of the non-governmental organizations that's wrote a lot of good research on natural resources, both in West Africa and other parts of the world. Suspended their involvement because of the lack of enforcement and the questionable practices that actually question whether it was actually making a difference. So you see two international efforts started at roughly the same time. One focusing on major infrastructure projects, major investments in foreign investment in exporting natural resources. It involves multinational corporations using and moving large amounts of minerals, and that was seen as being relatively successful and expanding. Kimberley Process, one in which you have public pressure towards trying to present conflict-free diamonds, but one in which it can be more difficult to actually enforce, because a lot of these, you can't tell the difference really between an alluvial diamond and a kimberlite diamond unless you're an expert, I guess. And they're a lot smaller and a lot easier to smuggle than these large amounts of minerals, coltan, copper, gold, or whatever. And so you can make an interesting theoretical argument about the type of resource and the value that it has, and the difficulties in trying to create international regimes to try to regulate and encourage transparency and responsibility. A couple of general conclusions about today. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think there's a lot more that you can teach an entire class on natural resources and conflict. I think for me, the motivating question was, how do natural resources affect a country's stability, politically or economically? The literature has put forth a number of different mechanisms. Oil, by and large, has the disproportional effect. Humphreys, I think, gives a pretty much exhaustive list on the number of different mechanisms. That special edition that his article was a part of was, I think, the high point in the natural resource and conflict literature. In recent years, I haven't seen as much work being done on this area. I think a lot more of it has gone subnational, kind of like my project, looking at how conflict diffuses and how conflict diffuses around areas for research for natural resource production. But it's something that I think is due for a renaissance. There's been a mix of different small and large-scale international efforts of trying to increase transparency, and there's incentives for pushing this both from consumers like us, buying companies, as well as governments, to try to increase transparency with the theory that should reduce the amount of corruption and rents that could go towards repressing citizens or towards funding of conflicts. It's unclear what the sustainability of these transparency efforts, but given the amount of information that's come out recently on transnational financial flows, I think this is an area of future research, as well as a trend that I think is going to be coming with us, that transparency can cut both ways, as we've seen in recent years, but relating to natural resources and conflict, given the international nature of natural resources, I think there's more tools for control and incentives for cooperation than maybe water or food products. So yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, ending with international efforts, which we're going to come back to more in week 12. I look forward to the workshop and giving us a chance to get more discussion about these different topics and get your take, as well as your takes on the readings. So see you then.